Good evening. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I have the great honor of being the Dean of Columbia Journalism School. And prior to being the Dean of the Journalism School, I was the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism and the director of the Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. So this program is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to be able to moderate this conversation with four of our recently selected Lipman Fellows. And so just so you have some familiarity with what the Lipman Fellow program is, well, the Lipman Center does a number of things, one of which is that it oversees two distinct fellowship programs, one specifically in criminal justice reporting, and one more broadly in civil and human rights journalism. And we try to step in, given some of the pressures that are facing journalists and news outlets now. We try to step in and be supportive, for stories that might not have gotten done otherwise, or might have been much more difficult to get done. And we offer some financial resources. We offer some access to the resources of Columbia, i.e. the library, et cetera. And we have a kind of growing community of Lipman Fellows now that we're really proud, because we've been doing this for how long, Dolores?
We've been doing it since 2018.
Since 2018, okay, so we've had 4 classes. And very proud of the work that people are doing. I am going to introduce our panelists as soon as I can find the document on here. And got it. Okay. So starting from my left and going over. Lauren Gill is an independent journalist whose work has appeared in Slate, The Intercept, Insider, and elsewhere. She received a fellowship and a grant from the Lipman Initiative for Reporting Race and Criminal Justice, for a project on the indigent defense system in Houston County, Alabama, where defendants must pay between $350 and $3,000 for a court-appointed lawyer if they are found guilty. To her left is Nicole Einbinder, who is a senior investigations reporter for Insider. She received a Lipman Fellowship, she received a Lipman Fellowship and a grant from the Lipman Initiative for Reporting for a project that examines the deliberate indifference standard and how it makes it impossible for incarcerated people, largely non-white and poor, to seek justice for violations of the 8th Amendment around excessive bail, fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. And just to her left is Mya Frazier, who is an independent journalist and a reporting fellow at the University of Missouri's Watchdog Writers Group, and who's using her fellowship for a project on housing as a human right in the era of the automated landlord, which is, I know when we saw that proposal, we were just kind of like, what? And then kind of read about what was happening, and just kind of one stunning detail after another. So, really eager to talk to you about your work on that. And then finally, we have Tanvi Misra, who is an independent journalist whose work has appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, and elsewhere. She received a fellowship for her project on unaccompanied migrant girls who arrive in the at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking refuge and safety, but likely find something else instead. So, welcome to all of you. We're very excited to have you here, and I like to start with the 10,000-foot questions, and then kind of work our way into more fine details. But for everyone, I guess we can start on my left and kind of go down. For everyone, could you take a minute to talk about how you became aware of the issue that ultimately became part of your proposal for the Lipman Fellowship. Lauren?
Sure. So I do a lot of reporting in Alabama. So I was talking to some lawyers in Houston County, which is where I'm reporting on, and we talked about one issue, and they said, well, do you know that also people are charged for an attorney even though they say they're unable to pay? And I was, kind of blown away. I've reported on the criminal justice system for a while now, and I hadn't heard about that. So I asked around. There was an official document to back it up. It's been a rule for years now. And I talked to some national people who said this is actually a pervasive issue in the criminal justice system, but it's one that's often overlooked. So I decided, would be really interesting to look into, especially because it impacts millions of people. And so that's how I came to find that.
When we saw that proposal, it immediately reminded me of the old convict lease system that emerged after the end of slavery, after the demise of formal slavery. And under that system, particularly in Mississippi, a judge would be given, the judge's pay was determined by whether or not he found someone guilty or innocent. And you would get one fee for finding someone guilty, and then around half that fee if you found them innocent. And so there are these kind of incentives that kind of lead to putting your thumb on the scales of justice, so to speak. So Nicole.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I came across my story project while actually pitching for a totally different story, which happens sometimes. So my team at Insider, I'm on the investigations desk there, were pitching potential stories for a different project. And during that process of pitching, I came across the deliberate indifference standard and just kind of was struck by it, just totally out in the open, legal standard, a lot of people, in the legal world, attorneys and so forth, know about it, and just kind of know it has a really high bar to meet. So it's kind of one of those plain sight things, and so I mentioned it in this pitch that I sent to my editor, and he called me up after, and he was like, Nicole, that's crazy. I think this could be its own potential story, and that was kind of the genesis. And from there, I started just reaching out to as many attorneys as I possibly could find. I've done some prior reporting on prison conditions, particularly prison conditions during COVID. So I kind of reached out to my network, and everybody, they told me horror stories about the standard and how difficult it is. And from there, just decided that it was something that deserved more attention. And since it's kind of quirky, legal-esque, so kind of broadly speaking, what the standard is that not only does an incarcerated person have to prove that their Eighth Amendment rights were violated while incarcerated, they have to prove that the prison official or the warden or whoever subjectively knew that this happened or that this would cause harm. Now imagine, you're incarcerated, largely pro se, and you're trying to prove that the prison official who has access to all your medical records, all your documents, controls every aspect of your life, trying to prove that they were thinking and had the mindset that they knew this would happen. And a lot of people aren't able to seek redress in the courts for really blatant Eighth Amendment violations, really blatant human rights violations because of this. So,
Mya?
Hi. So it's a little winding. How I came to this story. Early on in COVID, I had been working on a piece for quite a long time for the Times magazine about the relationship between housing insecurity and the credit system. And that had, I had spent a lot of time in eviction courts, both in Las Vegas and also, I happen to live in Columbus, Ohio. Because I couldn't travel much during COVID, I had spent quite a bit of time down in eviction court just sort of watching, observing, getting to know the legal aid attorneys. There are a couple characters from that. Well, there was one that eventually made it into that story that I spent a lot of time with, and just started talking to a lot of the eviction bar. So I was just like, legal aid attorneys, they're amazing sources. You know, they want to talk to you. They have great things to tell you. The eviction bar is less so. And I just got really interested in the eviction bar and what they do, what they're about, what they believe, really what they believe. I found that more interesting than anything. And I started having these conversations with the eviction attorneys, and quite, started spending, having coffee once a week with one of these eviction attorneys, when I would go down to court. And he just kind of started talking. He got comfortable with me, didn't really want to talk to me when I was in court at first, didn't really get why I was there. The way the local press tended to cover, the way evictions were kind of covered during the pandemic, they tended to be very, I mean, bad stuff was happening. They weren't, it was a really complicated time, and I think a lot of the coverage tended to be a journalist would go there and write a story like what happened that day, and I was more interested, everyone knew that was happening. I was more interested in how was the whole process changing. I mean, I'm sure everyone's read Matthew Desmond's Evicted book, and he really looked at sort of after it happened. I was really curious about the process kind of leading up, and the way the technological developments that were happening in property management were influencing the way the eviction process happened. And so and I'm a kind of a classically trained business journalist, so I think when you are that, you come to stories where you really think about the economic process of it. You're really who's making money, who's profiting, that's where you start usually. And the human story, of course, is always there, but I sort of always come to a piece of where's the profit? What is going on? And so that got me interested in looking at just the massive change in property management. And so that led me to sort of investigating all these companies and the way they work with the eviction bar. And so that's sort of how it evolved. But I'm a freelance magazine journalist, so you are always trying to find your next story when you're working on your current story. So that sort of led, finding new sources, talking to people, it's imperative, or, you don't get your next story. So that sort of led. So that was probably enough.
Kill, right.
Yeah.
Tanvi.
So my story is a little bit different in that I think, this one is not an investigative story really, but the way that it really started, I think, is with a person. And I think before that, the way that I got to that person was a question that someone, and I don't remember who this was, posted on Twitter. This was under Trump, and I was covering sort of the day-to-day of immigration. I've been covering immigration and criminal justice for a number of years now. And I was covering, I don't know if everyone remembers, but there was a big increase in the arrivals of unaccompanied minors at the border. And I was covering that. I went and toured a facility. I was covering sort of the policies. I was talking to people who were, employed in these places. And I at some point, on Twitter, someone asked, we're always talking about these people as if they're not in the room. What if we actually asked them what they think of these things? And that really stuck with me and stayed with me for a really long time. And I think a lot of my work post that has been informed by that question. And this story, in sort of, kind of trying to respond to that question, I reached out to a young woman who'd come here in 2015 and had now, at this point, spent a number of years here. And And I spoke to her, last year, had a very extensive interview. And her story was not, it didn't fit the narrative. It didn't fit this narrative that we hear, that these kids, these young people, they come here and their lives become so much better after they come here. And that was something that I wanted to, kind of unpack a little bit more, because I think in the wider immigration coverage, about which I have a lot of thoughts, we never get to those nuances. Your life may be better in some ways, but it might be a lot worse in some ways. With this woman, the case with her was that she never was able to reunite with her family. So she's alone, still alone in this country, pretty, just kind of doing things on a day-to-day basis, not really able to enjoy what was her childhood and not really able to grow up. And so that really became the pillar for this piece, which obviously goes much beyond her at this point, but that's really what got it started.
Can we start, I guess, in the opposite order and talk about the impact of the issue or the implications of the issue that you're writing about?
Yes. So for me, this was this story also represented a gap in coverage that I saw. I mean, myself included, and all everyone who's on this beat focuses a lot, for good reason, on the journeys that people make up to the border and then the treatment that they face at the border. A lot of my investigative work focused on those things as well, especially like what happens at the border, what happens with in the facilities that these kids are kept in. But I think there's not a lot of coverage, and there's not a lot we know about the years after. Their immigration cases take numbers of years. That they're extremely complicated. They have to kind of make a case. They don't, it's logistically very complicated. And then obviously there's the emotional, educational, social, and all of these other pieces that we absolutely had no idea about. It was kind of a black box. And so I think the implication and sort of for this story is that it provides a little bit of a window into just the lack of support hundreds of thousands of young people who come to this country have after they actually arrive here, after after the cameras go away and no one, and people stop paying attention.
There you go. I feel like I'm doing karaoke or something. It's got that whole vibe.
I mean, we can do that. We have
okay.
like a small
can
crowd
we,
here. We can just sing along. I will survive, everyone.
All right. You
There it
first.
is. You first.
Jelani.
No, you first.
Well, I think there was a lot, during the pandemic, there was just, you had the cancel rent movement. You had, for the first time in this country, we actually we gave real help to people to pay their rent, which had sort of never really happened in an easy way. I mean, if you look at what's gone on with funding for public housing, I mean, that's just, and this was sort of this amazing moment in American history where we decided, yeah, we actually have to help people. We cannot watch people end up completely in the streets in the middle of a pandemic. And that was sort of swirling around, and there was a lot around that. But I think more broadly, this question of, housing as a human right, I always feel like when something's going on strongly on the left, it's a lot more interesting to look at who's in power and, like that's all legitimate and really interesting from a social movement standpoint, but you can't really cover that in an interesting way. I think it's much more interesting if you think about going deep on the forces any sort of social movement is trying to rub up against. And so I would say that's what sort of drove my reporting on this is, I think as a journalist, what I always try to do, and I think this comes from being early on in my career being a business journalist, is look at what's going on in the private market. And the government can only do so much. They're very restricted. most of what we're fed through the media is so polarized these days, and I think it's a lot more interesting to just figure out what's really happening on the ground. And so that's what sort of propels my reporting, generally speaking, is like, well, what's actually happening? What are the companies doing? What are the, how is this being mediated? Who's got the power? That's always the most important question, and where our reporting should always be, in my opinion. So that's why I sort of lean toward that way. So,
Can you say a little bit about what the automated landlord system actually does?
Sure. I feel like I'm being cagey because my piece hasn't published yet.
Okay, all right.
So it's a little weird.
I should say this. Like, we're trying to balance this. I was trying to make sure we had like an equal balance of people knowing what was going on without kind of like that.
Yeah.
But if that's over a line, a particular line,
we'll
leave it right there.
No, that's fine.
And we will happily move on to karaoke and do the next thing.
Like everything in we're living in this, we all know this, we're living in this algorithm age, we're living in this age where our data is mediated all the time, where companies make decisions based on, they can just turn a dial and they know they can increase profits in a certain way. And so when you think about the consolidation that's happening to America's housing stock, like, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that massive changes are going on in the landlord-tenant relationship. And so if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nicole, in as broad or general as you, or as detailed as you like to be, about the impact of the issue that you are writing about.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it
Okay.
in some detail. I think what's most troubling about the standard, and what kind of shocked me, and I had to kind of go back a second, like, wow, that's really happening, is the fact that hundreds of thousands of American citizens who are incarcerated in our jails and prisons all over the country essentially don't have the Eighth Amendment protections that are supposed to be granted to all people in this country. Have it on paper, don't have it in right, and just the high bar that this legal standard posed. I started reporting, as I said earlier, on prisons during the pandemic. Sent my first letter to a prisoner, actually, when I was at the J School, Amy's class. And I've always been fascinated by just how inhumane, conditions are in these places that are supposed to be, they're supposed to be operated by the state. They're supposed to have funding. There's, it's very much a punishment model as opposed to a, rehabilitation model, which is how it is in many other parts of the world. And historically, there hasn't been much attention on what's happening behind the scenes in these places. It's kind of a black box. These folks are incarcerated. It's really hard to get in touch with people. When you get someone on the phone, it's all recorded. So the prison can kind of monitor what's happening. They dictate if you can go in or out, all of that. And I've always been really interested in trying to figure out a way to, raise some attention and better understand the experience of folks who are in these places. And my interest in the standard is just the fact that something so basic as access to the Constitution, access to the courts when you're suffering a serious violation of your basic rights isn't granted. And what's even more preposterous is, even folks who have attorneys are losing these cases. I mean, if you're pro se, you almost have no chance. And if you're with counsel, you might have a chance, but it's still really difficult. And I've talked to a ton of attorneys during this process. I've gone through a lot of cases. Attorneys are, they're defeated, they're frustrated, but there's not really anything that can be done. I mean, the standard came about from a Supreme Court decision. So the standard originally stemmed from a case in the 70s called Estelle v. Gamble, but the current interpretation is from a 1994 case. And the current makeup of the Supreme Court, that interpretation is not going to be altered or in favor of prisoner rights anytime soon. So yeah, my interest and why I think this could be impactful is just raising attention. I found a lot of parallels between deliberate indifference and qualified immunity.
That was literally the next question I had for you.
Exactly. I mean, it's
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm assuming people in the audience are familiar with qualified immunity. Basically it shields cops who are using excessive force from liability, and the deliberate indifference standard essentially is doing the same thing but for prison officials, where it's shielding prison officials who are essentially turning a blind eye to what's happening in the facilities, because they can use the excuse, oh, I didn't know about it, and if they didn't know about it, it's not deliberate indifference. And talking to legal experts, they've told me that it could also potentially create the perverse incentive that a prison official would deliberately not do the trainings, or they deliberately be negligent on the job, because as long as they're not liable. And I've come across some cases, I've been looking through circuit court data where, just that is happening. One case, it happened back in 2012. It was in New Hampshire, and this incarcerated person was lured into someone's cell and just beat up, really viciously assaulted, and then was left there on the bunk bed and wasn't even in his own cell, which is a violation of prison policy. And the prison guards are supposed to be walking every few minutes. They're supposed to be going through and checking in on people and making sure everyone's where they're supposed to be and that nothing's happening, in addition to cameras and because there's so much surveillance in these places, which all of a sudden when you're submitting a record request, they don't have the videos anymore. But this person was just viciously assaulted there for an extended period of time, and the prison official wasn't doing her job and checking in the cell doors, and this person ended up suffering pretty serious traumatic brain injury. Spoke to his attorney recently, and this person has since passed away, and was a pretty young person. It's unclear if the injury was the result of this, but things like that are happening in our prisons every day. Assaults, really abhorrent medical neglect. I mean, that's one of the biggest chunk of these cases are, not getting basic health care. Another case out of Arkansas, this person had diabetes, and he asked for his orthotic shoes because he had charcot foot, which is a symptom of diabetes, to help him walk and so forth, and they wouldn't give him his shoes. I mean, it's the most simple ask possible, and this person ended up getting his foot amputated, all because they wouldn't give him, his orthotic shoes. So, I mean, it's just countless stories. During COVID, it's exacerbated even further because of, social distancing and medical care and, all that. I mean, it was non-existent during the pandemic. But all these circuit courts across the country found that as long as the prison did something, even if that something was, I'm putting you in solitary confinement to separate you, but you're still locked away in solitary, or I'm giving you a mask, but it's one mask every 6 months and it's falling apart. And these are just all examples I'm making up, but you kind of get the gist. But as long as the prison did something, the facility can't be held liable. So it's just so much stuff that is happening. And it's just really enraging and really dehumanizing, and being able to kind of raise attention to this. And as I said before, and kind of unlike qualified immunity, which there has been, I think, some push to, now that there's been more focus on it, to try to get that changed and reformed. But, deliberate indifference comes from the Supreme Court, and as I said, that's not going to be current makeup. That standard won't be altered anytime soon, but just trying to kind of raise attention on this and say, hey, this is happening, and telling stories of folks that normally wouldn't have a chance to have their story out there.
Lauren?
Yeah, so I mean, when I talk to people, everyone watches these crime shows where the police say if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. But in reality, that's not happening. these attorney fees are chilling the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. And so that was my biggest motivation for looking into this story. You know, people a lot of times don't even know that they're being charged these fees. But imagine, you know, if they do, you're going to get charged $2,000 for a lawyer. Like, you could just hire a private attorney yourself in a lot of these cases where people are racking up thousands of dollars in bills. So that's what really drew me to the piece and doing this investigation. And another thing is, like, it's not the sexiest of criminal justice issues. It's not wrongful convictions or forensics or any of that. But at the same time, it's an issue that affects a ton of people. 80% of criminal defendants are indigent, so that means that they're unable to afford a lawyer, so they're being hit with these fees. And as part of the story, I was really hoping to bring out how people are impacted. You know, you hear from lawyers and advocates and all those good people, but I think it's really important to hear from the people who are facing these fees themselves. And so far, their stories have been like heartbreaking to hear, trapped in the criminal justice system for years just for exercising their right to counsel. And even more horrifying is that this seems to be happening all like above board in the places, kind of, sort of. But you know, that's why I think like it's important to look into.
We, first off, none of us associated with Lipman can go to the state of Alabama because we've done, in like the 4 years we've been doing this, probably like 4 or 5 Alabama stories. And we keep, like, we're looking at proposals, go, oh, here we go, we're not gonna be able to go there. Which means something because, you know, my whole maternal side of my family is in Alabama. And so, you know, it was my cousin who, in frustration, he's a social worker in Alabama. He said that is the single most frustrating job it's possible to have in Alabama. And he said one day after a particularly rough time, he said, you know, if this whole state just disappeared and sank into the ocean, no one would notice us until we were gone, until the next Auburn game. And I was like, that was like the level of his frustration about it. And so we were looking at this proposal about kind of yet another depredation that we were seeing in this like one particular place. But at the same time, it was such an egregious thing that we were like, okay, we really want you know, to support this reporting. And so to the extent that you can, talk about the obstacles that you've encountered in reporting, thus far in reporting your projects. And we can just kind of jump in whatever order.
I can go. I have a pretty major obstacle that I can talk about. Yeah, my main character is nowhere to be found.
Well,
so
yeah, that could be an issue.
I have another main character now, but it's not surprising because that was, and I remember, I think I put that in the proposal. This is a particularly difficult group of people to track and follow over time because they don't want to be found. And that, you know, and this is not the first time I've encountered that, and certainly that is, I think, so that's one of my biggest obstacles. It's also difficult to, I mean, it's difficult to strike up rapport and develop relationships that aren't, you have to maintain a really fine balance. It's a lot of people who've gone through a lot of trauma, and so, you know, trauma-informed reporting, all of, you know, I try to brush up on all of the rules because every interview is different, and there's really no way, no matter how well I prepare, there's always going to be something that, you know, is unplanned, and an emotional reaction or the kind of response that a question elicits, it's not always easy for me to prepare for that. So I think that's been some of the bigger, and then obviously, like, again, with this group of people, some of them are still going through an immigration process or are undocumented, don't always want to be, they don't want all these pictures of themselves. So negotiating the boundaries around that and expectations up front and being really clear about that has been really important, more so than obviously other stories, because these are a younger group of immigrants and who've gone through particular trauma. And being very clear and honest about limitations and what this will or will not do. There's also a lot of explanation of what journalism is and where this will end up, what I know, what I don't know at this point, who gets to know their information, because consent is a really tricky thing. Even, I always err on the side of over-explanation. And I remember when I was back at the Atlantic, we had a discussion over that where a lot of journalists disagreed with me. But I was talking specifically about this kind of a source. This, it would be very different, I think, from, for example, some of the more media savvy, or people in the system who are representing prisons or representing landlords. And it would certainly be different from an interview I do with Border Patrol. But these people there's just a lot of negotiation at every single point in the process, and then keeping them informed about the there's just a lot of over communication of expectations, what I can, what I can't do, and sometimes it's not only is the interview itself draining, because obviously people talk about things that may or may not be relevant to the story, but when they start talking, they talk about stuff, and it's really difficult stuff. One of my sources talked about a sexual assault that they went through, and sort of out of nowhere in the middle of the conversation, and things like that can throw the interview off. But sort of those were the bigger challenges, I feel like, with this story that I had to navigate. And again, I've done this, I've covered immigrants and immigration for a while, but I think this was a particularly difficult story for that, which is, it really helped to have the time to be able to, even if it wasn't with this person who I cannot find, and the organization that I, found her through also cannot find. But that's indicative in some ways of exactly the thing that I'm, some of the themes I'm talking about in the story. So yeah, it's just the relating to the people, the being really careful about their expectations and my expectations of them.
Anyone else?
I'll go. So I think one of my challenges has been not being on the ground. These aren't exactly interviews that you can do over the phone. Really being there with people and sitting down with them and explaining your process and who you are and why you want to know about this part of their experience in the criminal legal system that honestly a lot of them didn't even know about themselves. Those are things that are really important to be face to face. So I did have one trip down to Alabama that was pretty fruitful and was able to connect with some people. But I think ongoing, I'll definitely have to take another trip back now that I found some of the main people who I think will be featured in the story. Go back and sit down with them and have a more in-depth conversation. And of course, as I was interviewing them, letting them know that this is going to be a process. Strap in, this is going to be months. Is this something that you're willing to come along for the ride? And just letting them know expectations. And then I think another obstacle has been that there's not a lot of data surrounding the fees. So I kind of have to go and make some of it myself, which has involved requesting records from the court dockets where it's names of people who owe money for these attorneys' fees. And then I have to go and cross-reference that with the Alabama court record system, which has been its own challenge getting access to. So yeah, creating that data, and I think is one of the obstacles that I'm looking forward to tackling. I'll get there.
Yeah, speaking of Alabama court records, $10 just to look up a name. Yeah, had never come across that in other court records. It's definitely a tough place to get data. But I think kind of going off what both of you said, one of the biggest...
Per search?
Per search. You type in a name, $10, then you have to pay for all the records individually. And if you want to go back and get more stuff, you have to pay $10 again for the name. Yeah, it's really wild.
Make sure you spell it right.
Yeah, exactly. So for anybody interested in Alabama, if you're ready to pay a bit, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the hardest parts of the project and just, this type of work in general is, building trust with folks. Tanvi mentioned trauma-informed reporting. I think that's really important, and something that I try to incorporate into, any project that I work on. Emphasize that the ball is in your court, not mine. We're going to talk about what you're comfortable talking about. If you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to. Taking breaks, recentering the person. How are you feeling? How was it for you to talk about this? Making sure they feel in control, because a lot of these people have absolutely no control in any other part of their life. And as a journalist, the last thing you want to do is, be exploitative in any way or do something that makes that person feel uncomfortable. And yeah, trust building takes time. You're not just gonna, oftentimes not just gonna get someone to talk to you right away. It's just a constant, offering up, I'm happy to talk off the record. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have for me. And sometimes, over time, that person will decide, I want to talk to you. I don't think anyone else should have to experience what I've gone through. And other times, people aren't going to want to talk to you, and that's okay. And particularly for a lot of stories like this, you're never contingent on one person. Yeah, maybe it'd be great to talk to that person, and it's a really compelling story, but for a lot of these pervasive problems, there's lots of people out there. So yeah, being careful, being sensitive, and even just, a challenge that I've kind of been encountering is even just finding the central folks to talk to for this project. When I first started kind of going about this, as I mentioned, I reached out to my network and basically just asked everybody I knew, are there any really compelling cases that just really enraged you that you think I should be reading up on? And through that, I was able to kind of compile a list of cases and then, reached out to the attorneys, and, talking to attorneys is pretty easy. They're media savvy. They're pretty willing to talk to you, but getting the attorneys to introduce you to their client can be a whole other story. They're busy. They're doing this on their own time. Their client's not comfortable talking. So that's been kind of a challenge I'm facing right now of kind of keeping up on attorneys to, hey, have you talked to your client yet? But also trying to give them the space and figuring out, from there who might be willing to talk. So that's tough. And another challenge I face, that's kind of a additional component of this, is our goal for this project is doing kind of like a data analysis of analyzing a large swath of deliberate indifference cases over an extended period of time, to figure out, patterns in the data, how often are incarcerated folks winning these cases, if at all, versus the prison officials. And my background, I'm not a data reporter. That's not my expertise. Math was my worst subject in high school, as I'm sure many of you in this room, perhaps. So that's been kind of a unique challenge where I've tried to better understand how that side of things work. We're still working to kind of figure out who our data person will be to help us with this, And we're also, figuring out kind of what do we want to be looking for in this data? What are the main things, and going through, large swaths of cases. So, two kind of challenges that I'm dealing with right now.
So I want to let the audience know that we'll be opening up for questions shortly. And but I did want, some of you have touched upon this, but I did want to raise another question since we are a journalism school, and again, within the parameters of what you can talk about. Can you share with us the approach that you took to reporting out your story? Kind of methodically, like what you did to pursue the story that you're working
on? I generally start with like reading everything I can possibly find. I kind of divide it up. I look at anything in the scholarly literature first, because it's usually like a really good grounding, and then do a really rigorous Factiva search, look for everything. So you just kind of want to know everything that's in the public domain first, and just kind of ground yourself in just a lot of reading. And then I usually make a list of people I know I want to interview. And I like manila folders, and I scribble all over them whenever I'm working on a story. And I constantly write. It's not very methodical, but I write a lot of notes on my manila folders with and I print. God save the trees, but I print a lot of stuff out. And I just kind of try to, make sure I kind of do my list, like do my grounding stuff, and you just get a really good sense intellectually, like where you are, like what are you trying to do, what are you trying to say, have you read everything? I just think that's always really good to start off, but you can kind of do that too much too. Like you just need to get out there too and just talk to people. I liked, you do a lot of like early interviews and then print out your transcripts and read them and think about them and try to challenge your, how you went into a piece, your sort of preconceived notions. Are they holding up? Are you wrong? Like where, like all that a priori stuff that you do, that's ridiculous. And like try to be open to, wait, what is really going on? Like I think too often journalists, you start off with what you think something is, and then you just gotta stay really, really open to what you find when you report, because sometimes like amazing things happen and you're like, oh wait, I want to do that. And so I think that just staying open, but making sure you do your homework, read everything. That's my model. Yeah, so I don't know. And then writing, let's not talk about that. That's just like that's the toughest part. So deciding what to take out, that's the hardest part. So Tanvi, what do you?
I definitely start the same way and have everything. One thing that I found really useful is making a timeline once I've done that research, especially for kind of a big piece that has a lot of historical bits. I'm going into some of the history of like asylum or rights that immigrants, minors have had, and talked to a few historians about that. So just going into the history, anything that is like policy based, any policy changes big. There was a Flores Agreement in the 90s that really changed the way that we, the system treats immigrant children, like put that in there, and then also a timeline that is about your character. So when did this person, when did this person come? When did this person start their immigration case? All of that, and then because you can see then, sort of everything. I'm a visual learner, and so just seeing those, next to each other is really helpful for me to kind of see the narrative a little bit better. So I found that really helpful. I keep a source list as well. I have an Excel file for everything. And one thing that I found very helpful for in terms of organization is I have a, I don't know if this is really the detail you wanted, Jelani, but I just love talking about organization because I've stolen everything from everyone else. None of these are my own ideas, but I make a trunk document in Google Docs, which will have my source list linked out. Everything will basically be linked out, but I need that trunk document because that's the one that I have in my bookmark bar. So like for the ongoing project, so for each project. And so I'll open that. I have ADD, so I need that. Like I need like one place to go for everything to then branch out. But yeah, then that will have the source list, and then it'll have also a little subhead where I'll have, once I go through the transcripts, I'll have transcripts linked in there, and then also pull out quotes from, like anything that struck me after the interview. I'll often write that down on any notes from the interview that I was like, oh, this was particularly interesting, I should follow up on that. Things like that sort of annotated in that, and then after that, in that document is research, so any pull-out quotes from, or like little snippets or data from research, it's all in there, and then that's all linked down as well. But yeah, having that mastered, like a trunk file that kind of links out to everything is really helpful for me to keep things in place.
Anyone else?
I mean, most of my reporting isn't that fancy. Just talking to people, starting with national sources, people who I know have knowledge on this issue, and then from there asking, well, who else do you know? Who else should I talk to? Something that was surprisingly fruitful was posting on Twitter that I was doing this project, and actually some lawyers reached out to me and said that they had been working on this issue and have been really helpful. So that's a surprising one.
So we're going to open up for questions. I will forewarn you, I spent the afternoon at my daughter's kindergarten fielding questions from her classmates about what journalists do. You have 0% chance of actually being as tough as they are with their questions, including the one kid who said, how do I get on TV? And I was like, wow, really? Okay. So anyway, Alexis, good luck to you. That's the bar that you were trying to meet there.
My question is more specific to the stories about incarceration. And when I was listening, I was thinking, what has been your experience so far contacting families? Because there's so much a part of these stories of those who are incarcerated and the toll that that's taken. Are they particularly the ones where the story where the fees are so exorbitant and oppressive? What's been your response contacting families, and how invested they are in you getting this story out? Similarly with the ones with the conditions in the prisons.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so for this project specifically, I haven't actually reached out to families yet, but I have for other projects and kind of similar situations. My experience is oftentimes, families are pretty receptive. They know what's happening to their loved one, and they don't want it to happen. And, working at a publication or being able to write an article and raise scrutiny is a way to ensure that their loved one doesn't have to be going through whatever they're going through. But as I was kind of talking about before, it's a lot of trust building. It's a lot of explaining what journalism is for people that aren't necessarily savvy with how everything works, keeping them very up to date on the process and so forth. In my experience as well, a lot of times I go directly to the incarcerated person first, either or formerly incarcerated, either through attorneys, or if the person is pro se and doesn't have an attorney, kind of the old-fashioned writing letters, or using, some prisons have messaging software, like in New York it's called JPay. That's another way to get in touch with people. And then from there, oftentimes they're the ones who, let their family members know, hey, I'm talking to this person, they're interested in talking to you as well. And then they reach out to the family because they're invested in this and they want their experience out there. So yeah, generally pretty receptive. Of course, there's always times where people aren't comfortable talking, and if that's the case, it's okay as well. But generally, I think people know that something's happening that's not okay, and they want something done about it.
It's similar to your question too, about the family's role in this, and because when I think about it, what recourse do they have really is getting these stories out, right? And particularly this one, I was so shocked with all the exorbitant amount, like it was thousands of dollars when you're incarcerated and you're part of the indigent, right? And so the family probably is too. So I didn't know if you already had some engagement with some families who want people to know this is happening and we're stuck.
Yeah, well, actually, a lot of the people in my story aren't incarcerated. So having advocates connect me when I was down in Alabama, I was able to connect with the voting rights advocate who had been really active on criminal justice issues down there. And he introduced me to his daughter, who knew a lot of people in the community. So when we went to the court hearing, she knew people, she was able to kind of vouch for me a little bit and say, this isn't just some random person who's interested in hearing about some of the worst parts of your life. So I think, going that route, if you can. I know it's not always possible. Lawyers are usually pretty willing to play that role because they have a similar interest in getting these stories out.
I think going off of that, any story generally you're working on, having that person who's kind of like your guide to introduce you to other people in the community and who are involved with these issues and so forth is a really great resource, and something that's important, trying to kind of find that person early on, whether that may be reaching out to attorneys who are super engaged in that world. And I had one attorney who put me on a listserv of other attorneys who then, all these people reached out to me. And when you're in a community, having that person that is the advocate and knows the people that could potentially be in the piece and so forth. So just finding that person makes the job a lot easier because they have those relationships, and kind of working with them and having them be a part of that process.
If I may, before the next question comes up, I know my story is not about incarcerated people, or not currently incarcerated, but in the past, something that I found really helpful, I've done stories about people who were incarcerated and then in regular prison and then in immigration detention and then deported. And one thing that there have been instances where families have been cagey, and mostly that's been because they don't want this person to be defined by this thing, this whatever it is that they was the reason, the stigma about it. And so something that I've done in the past is say that up front, and make sure they know that I'm the kind of journalist who's going to make sure to have other aspects of their lives in the story, even if the story is about that. So I'll send them, I'll be like, I've done these stories in the past if you'd like to take a look, and build trust that way, because that's not something I want to do either. So being able to communicate that has been helpful.
My name is Ivy. I have two questions. The first is, in the case where you understand harm is being done by a system, a person, a corporate company, someone, but you still don't have the actual, the final evidence of it, how do you balance waiting for a whistleblower or someone who can speak to it and actually just reporting on it, given the policy could lead to this, or the data that is available could lead to this kind of harm? How do you balance waiting for a whistleblower or a character and reporting on the situation because it's important to report on it? And then my second question is, how do you manage your commitments to your full-time role and doing work necessary for the fellowship?
That's a good question. Was your question for any particular person? Okay. Okay.
I really liked your first question because I think it's so interesting. Because if you look at sort of the business world and you look at the startup world, there's like so much that's happening, and there's so much that can seem kind of outlandish, and what is coming, and there's like those stories are really important, but they are hard. But I also do think as journalists we do need to be writing about the kind of futures people want. And, because if you think about, oh God, this is gonna seem a little high, but I mean, we're all competing for a certain future. And, journalists, we can't just be writing about like what happened. We also have to be engaged in a process of, relaying to the public possible futures. And so I think doing the kind of reporting that lets people know what certain powerful interest, what they want, is really important reporting. And so I think that gets at what you were trying to ask about. I don't know if I have the solution for that. I mean, because sometimes there isn't harm yet, or there's like a system is evolving in such a way that's going to increase surveillance, or it's going to enable, certain actions against certain segments of the population, and it's very aggregated. It's not very individualized. It's kind of like, so that's hard. I don't know if I have good answers, but I really like the question. I think it's something in journalism we should talk about a lot more too, is how do we do that? As far as your second question, I don't know. I'm good. You just like, yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's really nice is if you're working on stuff that's all kind of interconnected, it's really helpful, because I mean, it can make you feel a little neurotic because you're like working on competing stories and they all kind of bleed into each other. But getting interested in a certain thing and just letting things kind of, that's how this works for this particular project, for me at least, is that it's informing some other work. And, I mean, that's the freelancer's like strategy though. So that's kind of what you do. But I don't know, anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point about finding that one whistleblower, that one person that's gonna make your story. I mean, oftentimes it's not as black and white as that. Yeah. There's lots of people to talk to that can illustrate this issue. In the case of the reporting I'm doing on this project, I mean, these conditions are so blatantly inhumane and such obvious human rights conditions, violations, that I think that the cases kind of speak for themselves and the experiences of folks. I mean, in terms of companies and so forth, I've done a lot of reporting on toxic workplace cultures, done stuff investigating the cultures at places like Bloomberg LP when Mike Bloomberg was running for president. I did a story on the toxic culture at Judge Judy, which was a kind of a fun one, interesting one to pursue. And
shocker.
Yeah, right. Crazy stuff. But look, I mean, a lot of it isn't just finding that person. It's just kind of what we've been talking about throughout this panel of building trust with people. Former employees in companies are, oftentimes they've signed NDAs. They're scared about talking, and it's kind of building that basic trust of, figuring out why they feel that their story should be out there. Oftentimes people are experiencing something particularly low, kind of on the bottom, people at companies, and they don't want other people to have to go through what they've experienced. And, finding the first person is often the toughest, but, they connect you to other people. And, frankly, a lot of it is just over-reporting. You send 100 emails and you hope that, 10 people, if that, respond. And that's just kind of a part of the job, putting in the work and building trust with people, not relying on one particular explosive whistleblower or anything like that. In terms of your second question, I'm fortunate that I work at a publication, so the nature of my job is, this is a project I'm working on, and it's kind of built into my day-to-day. My job is very project-focused, so, I'm not only working on this, I'm juggling another project as well, but they do give us the space, and I teams typically kind of give you more space to pursue stuff like this.
I have a good friend who's a reporter who said to me once, I always start with the ex-wife, the ex-husband, and the former business partner. it was like, if I'm gonna start from scratch, it's one of the people in those categories.
And the court records.
Yeah.
The Judge Judy story, I found all these court records, just racism, sexism, just crazy stuff was happening behind the scenes of this show, and the records were just sitting there at the LA Superior Court, and no one had bothered to go and get the records, so I spent the day at court. It's a terrible system there of collecting records. The computer froze every 10 minutes, and was, very, not super fun to deal with, but, you just go there and you get the records, and, a lot of this stuff is just hidden in plain sight and just kind of putting the work in.
Okay. I think my question is directed more toward Nicole. The abhorrent violations you found certainly aren't limited to the 21st century. Were you able to establish a pattern of systemic violence that goes unnoted in prisons and penitentiaries, or perhaps is even encouraged by officials? And were you able to tap into any archival records that would be made available to you at this time, because they're pretty historic?
I haven't looked too far back in history, but that's a very good suggestion. But no, kind of the span of the project I've focused on thus far is really since the Supreme Court opinion that established the current iteration of this, which is 1994. And for the span of the data analysis, right now we're kind of focusing on 5 years worth of data. So focusing more on that than going back historically. But I think you bring up a good point that systemic violence, systemic racism is just so entrenched in the criminal justice system in this country. And it's also just, the power dynamics of people who want to control others, and just a disregard for someone's life. You're less than, you're the prisoner. And that's led to kind of what we're seeing play out today in prisons all over the country, and it's not like one state or one place in particular has a, shining track record for criminal justice. It's pretty appalling across the board, from California to Alabama. And Alabama is particularly bad. There's been a strike there. I don't know if anyone's been following that or not, but just really blatant violence and stabbing. So Alabama is a really, particularly bad. But no, it's the way that the system is, and it's built on just these really entrenched systemic issues. And what's been fascinating for me while I've been kind of looking into this is the fact that, the way the standard works, you have to kind of lay blame on a particular person. That person had the mindset, but, my conversations with attorneys and experts, these systems aren't, it's not a one bad apple kind of thing. Oftentimes it's the warden who creates kind of like a fiefdom, and it's its own little world within the four walls of these facilities all over the country. But the way the standard works, the warden can't be held liable because that warden may not have known of this one specific incident that's in the suit. And if you can't go after the person that's running the system, then there's not really going to be any real change. So it's it's been interesting, and it's been really disheartening and it's horrifying hearing these stories. But I mean, it is a good suggestion, though, to kind of look back further.
Well, I had one other part to this question. Did you do a data breakdown racially? Did you look at those prisoners who were white as opposed to those who were black and perhaps even Hispanic or indigenous?
So at this point, we're still working through the data analysis and what exactly it's going to entail. So that's certainly one of the categories that we've been thinking a lot about. We're planning to have researchers that kind of go through and log from individual cases. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that we've talked about, but it's still kind of early days for the data analysis.
You have time for one more question. You go.
Hi, my name is Sheetal and I'm an MA student here at J School, and you might be aware that we are just starting out with our thesis. So I have the question, first question particularly to Tanvi, and the second question to the panel. So I just want to understand, like, with my thesis, I'm trying to reach out to people who are probably not documented, or they don't have any record and are sort of marginalized by the state. So how do you get hold of these people, and how do you go about such stories which directly stand against the state? And the second question that I have to the panel is, how do you maintain the newsworthiness of a story when it comes to long form narrative? Because at times we are like focusing too much on the story and we spend months, but when we finally come out with that, maybe it may not be as newsworthy as it would have been when the idea was conceived. So how do you maintain that? Thank you.
Those are great questions. To your first question, some of the more frequent ways or methods that I use is going through lawyers, as some folks mentioned that as well, going through lawyers, going through advocacy organizations. And then the longer that you're on the beat, obviously you build a rapport and relationship with various different groups, and I've also had some success reaching out to people on Facebook and Twitter. Facebook in particular has been very helpful. There's groups talking about, like, whether that's DACA or they're just based on problem solving around some of these logistics. And so I've certainly been able to find people who want to tell their stories because they're facing a certain kind of challenge in these places. But honestly, my best advice is always, like, if you can find a place locally where you can go and talk to people, that would be, the most. I mean, in New York, there's a huge undocumented South Asian community, and you just have to know where they are. You could go to the place where the taxi drivers hang out, or you could go to Jackson Heights and talk to some of the folks there. There'll be organizations, community organizations there. You could go through them. They could vouch for you if you could show them some of your work. That's sort of what I would recommend. But going and seeing people and talking to them in person, being able to speak languages that are not English, that's always helpful. Immediate rapport, right? So that's why, like, I would say, like, even for this story, the person that I found, whose experience is now sort of taking up most of the space in the story, because my main character is nowhere to be found. I found through local sort of connections, and so I was able to, so I feel like that is, I would really, really push for that. I feel like in New York, there is such a plethora of stories that are uncovered, and they are just happening all the time. There are just so many immigrants, and many of them are have issues with papers and documentation. So you're in a good place for that. With your second, to your second question, wait, what was the? I feel like
Newsworthiness of long
form.
Newsworthy.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, and I feel like I struggle with that because I do really love relishing like posting the productivity of like daily news coverage or weekly news coverage where you post something and you feel good, like, okay, you've jumped on something in time in the news cycle. I will sometimes you have to kind of change the direction of the story to add. I think the question I always go back to is like, what is the story adding to the conversation? And if there's something that's changing, is the story still relevant? And sometimes the answer is no. And then you kind of have to readjust and recalibrate based on the answers you get to those questions. But I've definitely asked that, and sometimes it takes a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of or a different framing, or something, a new sort of news event that could help kind of situate the story in a more sort of timely manner. But certainly something that I'm sure a lot of folks also have dealt with and can talk to.
If I can take the moderator's privilege and jump in on that question, what I'll say is to be very judicious about what topic you choose to do in long form in the first place. I have one football analogy that I use for lots of different circumstances. I'm a large person. As a teenager, people always tried to make me play football. My adolescent rebellion was to not. So I was an English major, and so I have one football thing but it's really useful. It's like a quarterback is throwing a football down the field. He doesn't throw it to where the receiver is. He throws it to where the receiver is going to be. And you're doing the same thing. So you're looking at a story going, we're thinking about, it's going to take X amount of time. Where do I think this situation will be at that point? And some things are unknowable. And then sometimes there are just kind of coincidences that come up and they feed into your story. Or I've had ideas that I thought about pursuing, decided that they wouldn't stay in the news long enough, but then waited for the next iteration of that. Unfortunately, that has been the case with stories around school shootings. That has been the case around climate disasters. It's been the case around, like, if you miss one cycle of it, if it's a big enough story, you can sometimes peg it to something else. And the other part of it is to work quickly, even when you're doing long form, to try not to have extra space or time in there, and the system rewards efficiency. I have one last question I would like for you all to answer, again, because we are a journalism school. Any advice for our emerging journalists who are interested in maybe covering subject matter akin to the work that you do? In any order. All right, we have no advice for you.
Okay, I got one.
You're on your own, basically. This is what we're telling you. Good luck.
I got something. I think I was a daily newspaper journalist for a long time in Ohio, and I wanted to get into magazine, and I think what helped me was I knew how to cover the economy. I knew how to cover business, and there's a lot of people, if you're going to cover the criminal justice system, like every long form journalist, there's a lot of people that cover that. There's a lot of people that cover, but there's not a lot of people that do long form that also sort of have done deep reporting on corporate America, know how to use SEC filings, know how to, really talk about what's going on in the economy. So I think that's a really, if you're studying, I think that's a really nice distinction, and really think about people's identities in their financial lives. And we don't really do enough reporting that it's such a big part of people's lives, and we don't cover that area as much. So that would be my advice. I think that's what has helped me.
Piggybacking off of that, I would say don't be afraid to go into local reporting.
Yes.
That's where I started out at the Brooklyn paper for 2 years, and honestly, it helped me build my career. I learned so much there, even just going to community board meetings where people are arguing about bike lanes. like the skills to go and like find like what's the story here and go back and write about it, and the community actually, you know, is really interested. But also the skills to just knock on people's doors and ask them questions. So I think that's a really valuable place to start as a beginning journalist.
You could even do it in Ohio. That would be like crazy.
Yeah, and I think, so my background, so I'm a J School alum, graduated in 2017, and I think what's great about this program is that you learn a lot of those skills. You learn how to door knock, you learn how to cold call people, you learn how to submit record requests. And honestly, I mean, a lot of the job is pretty straightforward. It's asking people questions and learning about their lives and trying to raise attention to issues that may be under the radar or not adequately scrutinized, or just keeping focus on power and money and all these systems that are making situations unfair for countless folks. And I think just one of the biggest things is just having empathy. The people that we're talking to are human beings, and they've gone through really tough things, and just having that, being careful. You might have a million things going on, you might be stressed, you might have the deadline for the story coming up, and all these things, but when you're in the interview, be present, give them your full attention, do your homework, don't go in blind, make sure that, if you're talking to an academic, read up on their background, know what their subject matter is and so forth, prepare interview questions, but just, be present, be empathetic, and I think trauma-informed reporting is really, really valuable. It's something that I learned how to do as a student here, and I've taken it throughout my career and all the various stories that I've done, from prison to Judge Judy, and everything in between. So, at the end of the day, we're all people, and just not forgetting that, and yeah.
The DART Center has some really good stuff on trauma-informed reporting, if anyone wants to take a look. I think, obviously, co-sign everything everyone said. I think my advice, when you asked that, I was like, actually, I could use some advice right now. My advice is, when I started in this industry, I think like many people, I was extremely starry-eyed and very naive about sort of both what I could do and what journalism can do. And I think my advice would be to ask yourself what does impact look like for you? What do you hope your stories achieve? Is it policy change? Is it documentation of a community that, or elevation of a conversation that no one's seen before? It could be something on a larger level or a smaller level, but I think clarifying that for yourself, and this can change for you as you evolve in your career. This can always change, but I go back to that question often, and I think the earlier you start asking that question, perhaps you'll be able to tailor some of your reporting and your projects and things better. Obviously, I know there's a lot of constraints. When I started out, I'm not a US citizen. I had constraints around where I could work and what skills I could get, but I wish I had asked that question sooner, because having answers to that would have, I think, prevented burnout, because I would be able to recognize the impact of certain stories that I feel like, in the past, like I've just been like, well, that didn't get the, kind of attention that I was hoping. I put so much into that story, but just kind of thinking about what that impact looks like on a larger and a smaller scale, I think would have been really helpful to me at that time. And then the second thing that I think came to mind was it's related to sort of empathy, but and perhaps this is not good advice to give to journalists, but in my opinion, the person is more important than the story. So I have given up stories when, and maybe that makes me a bad journalist, I don't know, but I think that it makes me an empathetic, I think it helps me understand my position in that instance and in sort of journalism generally. I mean, journalists have not always done good. Obviously, we've seen that in really any issue that you pick up. So I think understanding my position in that relationship and knowing that that person should have just as much power is important to me. And so if that means giving up on the story because this person is too traumatized to be able to carry on with the interview, that's what it is going to have to be. So I think those are two things that came to mind.
I'm very happy to hear you say that. I think that's a very important value. And we lose sight of the fact that the SBJ ethics code says that we should do no unnecessary harm. So thank you all for your contributions. Thank you all for the work that you've done and for the work that you're doing. As I said at the outset, we're very excited to have you as part of this growing community of Lipman Fellows. And we neglected to mention that it's kind of a lifelong affiliation. And so, like, you can't get out. It's like a permanent thing. And thank you. And thank you all for coming out.